So basically, Einstein's theory of general relativity, which I'm not going to explain in any detail. I mean, my point is to stand back a little bit and ask, why is it important, rather than to give you a detailed summary of what it says. But in effect, it is close to being what we might call a theory of everything. And as many of you will know, that is seen by some as the holy grail of science, a way of, in effect, finding a theory which explains all the other theories. In other words, the explanatory buck stops with this particular theory. And Einstein's theory of relativity comes close to it, but as those of your scientists will know, it is not actually such a theory of everything, because there are still things that remain to be correlated. But Einstein had a huge impact in North America and even in Britain, and of course he's an author of one of the world's best-known scientific equations, which is this. That's one you'll see on T-shirts in North American universities, and I'll explain that if I have time. But the key point I want to bring out is that Einstein really is a very significant scientist. It's absolutely fair to say that Einstein is a representative scientist, and then begin to ask what he does with all this thinking about the way in which the world is. And the theme I've put up here is the idea of holding things together. Because Einstein was very concerned that there was a degree of fragmentation taking place. What he meant by that was that some people, in fact, thought science was very important. There are others who didn't very much about science, thought that ethics was very important or religion was very important. And Einstein said, look, we've got to find a way of holding all of these together. And in many ways, that's the subject matter of this talk tonight, trying to work out how Einstein thought he could do it. And basically, Einstein was absolutely convinced that these were all important, namely science, ethics, and religion, but that there had to be some way of holding these together. And those of you who know German, you probably know this already, but throughout Einstein's writings, there's this constant emphasis on Einheitlichkeit, the idea that there's some fundamental unity which we can grasp, not completely, but we get enough of a sense of it to be able to say there is some fundamental big picture there, and we can grasp this imperfectly, but nevertheless we know it's there, and that means there is coherence, and we can begin to see ourselves as understanding a well-ordered universe within which we have a meaningful place. And within that, Einstein's thinking about religion plays a very important part. So in this lecture, in many ways, what I'm going to do is explain what Einstein thought. I'm just going to tell you straight, and then I'm going to start doing things with him. What I mean by that is say, here is what he thought now. What could a Christian do with this in beginning to think about the way in which we hold science and faith together? So I am indeed talking about Einstein. He's very interesting. But I'm also stepping back a little bit and asking, what can we learn from Einstein? What is there that we can take away from this that will help us think through this in turn? So that's really what I'm going to do in this lecture. So let's begin by thinking on Einstein, on science and its limits. And obviously one of the questions we have to explore is, who are the best scientists to dialogue with? And Richard Dawkins clearly would be one example, but Dawkins, I think, is not entirely representative of science. He takes a very, very aggressive view towards religion, which is not representative of the scientific community as a whole. And he also is unwilling to face up to the idea that science might have its limits. Dawkins is a very good example of someone who adopts what's sometimes called a scientistic way of looking at things, which means, in effect, a way of thinking about things, which says that science and only science is able to answer all of life's ultimate questions. And many scientists are very concerned about this because it represents a rather inflated understanding of what science is able to do. And most scientists would say something like this: science is a very valuable research tool which illuminates many things and illuminates them very well, but there are other things it does not illuminate. And therefore, to investigate those, we need to use different research methods. And Dawkins, I think, takes the view simply that if science cannot answer a question, then it is a non-question, and we ought not to be thinking about that. And clearly I want to say that's not really a defensible approach. And I'm using Einstein to help us think this thing through. So Einstein is very, very clear that, that the natural sciences are really very important. And he's absolutely clear about this. His love of science is really very, very clear. But he also makes the point that there's more to life than science is able to answer. We need to talk about moral values, and science isn't really very good at those. Some of you may have read Sam Harris, one of the New Atheists' book, The Moral Landscape, which is basically arguing that science can establish moral values. Those of you who have read it will know that he establishes in inverted commas, by basically smuggling in moral values from somewhere else, and ends up producing a very, very intellectually unsatisfactory account of things. But most scientists would say, look, science doesn't do moral values, and it doesn't do questions like the meaning of life, but these remain important questions, and if science is unable to answer them, then we answer them in some other way. And that is Einstein's view. He's very, very clear that these are interconnected, and in his very interesting essay, Why Socialism? Einstein was a socialist. He began to realize he had to keep quiet about this, but he certainly talked about this. And he began to make the point that the natural sciences simply cannot create moral goals. In other words, science may help us achieve moral goals, but it can't create them. It doesn't say, this is the good, and you should be pursuing it. It, in effect, just stands back and says, this is not scientific. These are moral questions, sort them out. And those of you who are philosophers will probably know that Einstein's favorite philosopher was David Hume, and Hume was absolutely clear that there's a big gap between saying this is what we observe in nature and this is what we ought to do. In other words, you cannot really argue from is to ought, which is a very important point to bring into this conversation. So Einstein is very, very clear that science has its limits. And he says that as someone who loves science, but is absolutely emphatic that that means you must be honest about science and not overstate its reach. So look at this quote, which I think is very, very helpful. Science cannot create ends, and even less instill them in human beings. Science at most can supply the means by which to attain certain ends. Again, that's from his essay on socialism. And the point he's making is that our sense this is the right thing to do comes from somewhere else. Science may help us say, well, having identified what we ought to be doing, we should do this, but does not create that moral vision in the first place. And Einstein makes a very good case for socialism, at least in his view, but he's absolutely clear that science doesn't actually deliver this. This is in effect something that the sciences are unable to establish, even though he believes that science is able to help us implement it. So an interesting question to pause and think about here is this. Are socialism and science incompatible? Now, I want you just to hold that in your mind, because actually it's not a question of whether it's science versus socialism or science versus capitalism or science versus liberalism. It is whether science is compatible with anything that cannot be established by scientific means. Because you will find people saying something like this. There's very common rhetoric in the New Atheism, that there is a methodological inconsistency between science and religion, which means that a scientist cannot be a religious person. The point I'm going to make to you is this. There's a methodological inconsistency between science and morality, between science and politics. Those arrive by the application of different and inconsistent methodologies, but I do not know anyone who would say, because I'm a scientist, I therefore cannot hold moral beliefs or I cannot hold political beliefs. They're all part of being a human being. And of course, it's all to do with the New Atheism's attempt to, in effect, make religion seem utterly irrational and incompatible with science. And we really do, I think, need to challenge that. And in many ways, Einstein, I think, does help us to do that. But Einstein gave a very famous lecture at Princeton in 1939 on science and religion. And this is, I think, an extremely helpful insight.
Einstein was writing at a time where the view that science and religion could have any meaningful conversation was seen with suspicion by many in North American culture. And what he has to say, I think, is very interesting. The scientific method, he writes, can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. The point he's making here is that we may aspire towards this objective knowledge, but that this knowledge of what goes on does not open the door directly to what should be. It's this point that a scientific understanding of the world does not tell us how we ought to act within it. And therefore, again, we can't deduce from science what the goal of our aspirations should be. And he goes on and makes this point. He says, the fundamental beliefs which are necessary and determinant for our conduct and judgments cannot be developed or sustained in a solid scientific way. And that, I think, is important. Einstein is saying science really matters, but we must acknowledge and respect its limits. And that is extremely important because, in effect, Einstein would be very critical of what we now call scientism, the view that science is able to determine or establish, for example, moral values, or indeed questions about the meaning of life. So here's what he says. Objective knowledge provides us with powerful instruments for the achievement of certain ends, but the ultimate goal itself and the longing to reach it must come from another source. So he's talking here about religion. He's moving towards saying religion is extremely significant. It gives us knowledge of ourselves. It gives us an understanding of a phrase he will use frequently, the mind behind the universe. And that helps us figure out who we are and what we ought to be doing. So Einstein has some very interesting things to say. He argues that science and religion are very clearly marked off from each other, but there exists between them strong reciprocal relations and dependencies, and this is one of his best-known lines: science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. The first point, he's saying you need a fundamental motivation to do science. And obviously, many scientists would say that uncovering the beauty or the complexity of nature is a very powerful motivation. But Einstein is saying there's something even more powerful. There is a religious motivation, which is by studying nature itself, you gain a deeper impression, a deeper appreciation of his phrase, the mind or the reason that is behind the universe. As we'll see shortly, Einstein does not really like the idea of a personal God, but nevertheless he's very, very clear that this is something that is important. And of course, those of you who know the Christian tradition well will be able to say, well, look at writers like John Calvin. Calvin makes it very, very clear that because the world is God's creation, a scientist who looks at the natural order gains a deeper appreciation of the order and the beauty of God, and therefore doing science is actually a way of deepening our appreciation and admiration for God. So there is a very important point being made there. But also, religion without science is blind. Why? Because, as we'll see in a moment, Einstein's view of religion is that it tends to be about recognizing that there is this mind behind the universe, but not telling us all that much about it, whereas science is able to help us in that way. So let me talk to you about Einstein on religion. The point I'm going to make is that Einstein means by religion something that you and I probably don't mean by religion. And therefore, we just need to be quite clear that Einstein is, in effect, opening up an understanding of religion which makes sense to him, although it might seem a little bit strange to ourselves. Einstein is sometimes depicted as an atheist. And you want an example of that? You might look at Richard Dawkins' populist manifesto, The God Delusion, which presents Einstein as a closet atheist who was repeatedly indignant at the suggestion he was a theist. There is no reference given for this, and that's not surprising because Einstein never said anything of the sort. So it is a little bit puzzling, to put it mildly, that Dawkins should think this. Dawkins actually is dependent on secondary sources and presents an extremely inaccurate account of Einstein's views. So we just note Dawkins' views, but we'll pass on. We'll just engage with Einstein rather than what Dawkins says about Einstein.
Here's what Einstein does say, and it's much more interesting. There's a letter of August 7th, 1941, in which Einstein expressed his indignation, yes, at the repeated suggestion that he was an atheist, or being quoted by certain kinds of atheist writers as if he shared their views, particularly those who, and this is a straight quote from Einstein, he termed fanatical atheists with a grudge against traditional religion. Now, I don't think I should say whether I think Richard Dawkins comes into that category or not. I shall leave that to you to decide. But you see the point I'm trying to make. Einstein is regularly misrepresented. So therefore, we're going to look at what Einstein thinks about religion, and then I'm going to use Einstein as a jumping off point to say, how can we think about this whole question using Einstein as a very interesting dialogue partner? So, let's look at Einstein religion. I'm going to make 3 points. The first of these is that Einstein did not believe in a personal God. He is absolutely clear there is some transcendent reality, and he calls this God. But he did not understand this God to be personal. That's quite an important point, because when Einstein was asked in 1929 by an American rabbi whether or not he believed in God, he gave this answer. He said, I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings. So Einstein is making it clear he's adopting a more philosophical view of God, not seeing God as a personal agent, but rather as some ground that lies behind the universe, whose wisdom is shown in the structure of that universe. And Einstein is quite clear that he does not believe in a personal God, and he argues that this gives rise to conflict between science and religion. He doesn't really explain why very satisfactorily. I think it's because he feels a personal God might interfere with the laws of nature, but it's not as clear as we would like. There's his reasoning. But the point I want to make is this. Again, if you read popular atheist writings like Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, you will find people making this interpretation of Einstein. Einstein did not believe in a personal God. Well, that's right. And interpreting Einstein does not believe in a personal God to mean Einstein doesn't believe in God, which is not right. Einstein simply is saying, I believe in a more impersonal view of God, as we'll see. Because Einstein then makes the point that religion is a response to a transcendent reality. Again, this idea of a mind behind the universe, but he's saying there is something out there, something beyond the universe, something that's reflected in the universe, and catching a glimpse of this gives you a motivation for doing science. And even though Einstein was critical of the idea of a personal God, Einstein said, look at this second paragraph, that despite his own misgivings about the idea, a belief in a personal God was still preferable to the lack of any transcendental outlook on life. In other words, a way of looking at life which refused to acknowledge there is something that stands behind the universe. So that, I think, is a very important point to make here. Einstein declares his firm belief in a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience. And Einstein is very, very clear that we may experience a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, or even amazement at the beauty and complexity of the world. And Richard Dawkins says that that kind of way Einsteinian subjectivity is all Einstein means by religion. It's not. Yes, there is a subjective response of admiration or awe or wonder at the beauty and complexity of the universe, but there is also this objective dimension, that there is this superior mind which lies behind all of this, and science catches glimpses of this by its uncovering of the complexity and the ordering of the universe. So that, to me, is a very important point to make. Again, Einstein is very, very clear that this transcendental outlook means believing in a force or a mind or a reason which transcends nature and which, in effect, lies beyond our capacity to grasp it fully. So that is really beginning to map out what Einstein says on religion, but there's a third point, which is really quite interesting that Einstein, in effect, does not see religion as involving ritual or devotional practice. And again, to most of us, this will seem as puzzling because Einstein is clearly using this word religion in his own way. As far as we know, Einstein never attended a Jewish worship service. And again, if we look at why he thought Judaism, he was a Jew, why Judaism was so important, he gives some reasons. 3 reasons, in fact. And the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, an almost fanatical love of justice, and a desire for personal independence. But actually, none of these are theological or religious as we would understand it. And more than that, as far as we know, Einstein never attended worship, and you probably know, Einstein, when he died, basically asked for his ashes to be just deposited in the Delaware River. There was no religious ceremony. So Einstein's view of religion is slightly unusual. And so that's why I think it's very important to try and work out how we categorize this, and then where we go from here in thinking about what this means and how we can begin to use this in our thinking about defending religion in an age which seems very uncomfortable with it. So Einstein has a view of religion which doesn't really map onto traditional ways of thinking about this idea. And I want to suggest that actually his general concept of religion might be better thought of as philosophy of religion. In other words, a set of ideas concerning a transcendent basis to the universe and the question of how we can know and represent it adequately without losing sight of its wonder and mystery. And Einstein's also clear that this changes the way in which we see and act in our world. Now, as I've been talking about this, I'm absolutely sure many of you will be saying, actually, I can just see how a Christian way of looking at things begins to give substance to this and actually moves it way beyond where Einstein left it. And that actually is where I'm going to take the remainder of this lecture, because it seems to be very important to begin to ask, how can we take Einstein and use him to reflect on some of these really big questions? So what is important for Einstein about religion? Well, he says the most important function of religion in the life of man is that of disclosing our fundamental ends and valuations. In other words, it's all to do with questions of meaning and value. Why do we think we are here? What is the point of life? And to set them fast, to solidify them in the emotional life of the individual. And that really is where the most interesting part of this lecture begins, which is what can we learn from Einstein? And so what I'm going to do now is begin to unpack this and ask, what does Einstein say that we can benefit from, that would help Christians to think about their faith, or indeed to converse about their faith in a secular culture and begin to open up some very important questions. So what I want to do is just make a point right at the beginning, which I think is really important. I mentioned Arthur Eddington earlier. Arthur Eddington, remember, was the guy who in effect held that press conference announcing that the observations of solar eclipses in May 1919 confirmed Einstein's theory of general relativity. A British scientist, best known for that 1928 classic, The Nature of the Physical World. And in that book, Eddington says, look, science is great, but it doesn't map totally onto what human beings need if they are going to lead meaningful and fulfilled life. He says there's a mismatch between the pure objectivity of physics and the subjective experiential world of individuals. And this is the quote, which I think is really helpful. Minkowski is about space-time, space-time, in other words, 4 dimensions. But the key point is what is said at the end. Something must be added to the geometrical conceptions comprised in Minkowski's world before it becomes a complete picture of the world as we know it. In other words, purely objective accounts of nature are not good enough to meet human existential needs. And that is a very important point. So I'm going to explore with you in the remainder of this lecture that there's more that we need. Supposing I put it like this: it is really helpful to know how our universe, or indeed how we function. But for most of us, there's something else, which is the question of what the universe and what we mean. What is the point of life? Why are we here? And those are deep, significant questions. They're what the philosopher Karl Popper calls ultimate questions, one that in effect science is not able to answer, but which are nevertheless fundamentally important for human beings. And that's why I think we bring Karl Popper into this conversation. Popper, a well-known philosopher of science, very influential in the 40s and 50s, and actually still talked about extensively today. He says it's important to realize that science does not make assertions about ultimate questions, about the riddles of existence, or about man's task in this world. And he insisted that these ultimate questions about meaning, purpose, and value could not be properly answered by science. But that does not mean they are unanswerable. So here is the point I'm going to make to you. What does Einstein help us do? Einstein is in effect showing us that science really is very wonderful. It's to be loved, it's to be appreciated, but it's also to be respected because it has limits. And those limits actually are quite significant. And Einstein is inviting us to see science as it is, recognizing those limits, and because we need this bigger picture of reality than science is able to give us, we need not just science, but ethics and politics and religion to see some way of bringing all of these together. And that really is Einstein's big contribution, to insist that methodological divergence, by which I mean these answers are arrived at by different forms of argumentation. There's science, which gets us its ideas from here. There's religion, which gets its ideas from there. But the key point is, whatever their source, you can weave them together in a coherent whole. And that was Einstein's big insight. You had to do this. He may leave open the question of how we do it, but I want to suggest to you it's really important that it can be done. And Popper makes this point: the fact that science cannot make any pronouncement of ethical principles has been misinterpreted as indicating that there are no such principles. So Popper and Einstein are both making a very similar point. Science is a tool. It's a wonderful tool, but it does not do everything. And in fact, it does not do a lot of things that you and I would consider to be enormously important. So that opens the way for bringing in other ideas relating to meaning and value, and saying these can be held alongside what science is talking about. Now, of course, new atheist writers are alarmed by what Popper is saying. Richard Dawkins, for example, regularly refers to Karl Popper as a truth heckler. I have to say, he doesn't seem to have read Karl Popper, or not read him very well, but the key point I would want to make is that actually many scientists would say that is just so obviously true that it does not need discussion. Interestingly, Sam Harris is clearly worried about this final point, about science not being able to establish moral values, and feels that therefore you need to be able to show that science is able to establish moral values as a way, in effect, of neutering the appeal of religion. Einstein takes a view which I think many of us could relate to, that ethics in the end cannot simply be the free choice of human minds, but is rather a response to something that is deeply embedded within the order of reality itself. In other words, Einstein is talking about something transcendent, which he calls God, and ethics is grounded in this transcendent reality. It's not something we invent, it's something we respond to. And again, you can see immediately how that fits in very strongly with the Christian idea of God. And it is an important point. Even Iris Murdoch, who was an atheist, was very sympathetic to the Christian vision of God precisely because it gave you stabilization of moral values. If there is a God, as Christians understand God, then that gives you a ground for saying there are certain moral values which are not our invention, but rather our response to the nature of God himself. So it is actually a very important point to make. Einstein was well aware that his own approach had its limits as well. And Einstein, interestingly, wrote quite a moving letter of condolence on the friend of his friend Michele Besso in March 1955. I'm going to read this to you. And as I read it to you, I think you'll probably feel this is a rather strange letter of condolence. Here we go. Now he, Michele, has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing, for believing physicists like us know that the distinction between past, present, and future has only the meaning of a persistent illusion. Let me explain what he means by that. I'll leave you to figure out how on earth the unfortunate family of Besso responded to it. What Einstein is saying is, look, there are these things called world lines, and there's a world line there. It goes from the past to the present to the future. I mean, give its coordinates, x, y, z, t, x, y, z, and so on. And that's very, very straightforward. But anyone reading this will say, well, I'm sorry, I mean, in the past, I wasn't there. In the present, I'm here. In the future, I won't be here. And actually, it is quite important to me that I am here at this moment, that I am significant, that I'm reflecting on this. What, in Einstein's view of things, is the role and the significance of someone who is thinking about the immensity, the vastness, and wonder of the universe and their own place within it? And the answer seems to be it doesn't really fit in very well, because Einstein is so objective, he can't really see the subjective human interest in meaning and value. And yet, in many ways, it's those precise concerns that make us human beings. And that, I think, is very important. Some of you will know this name is Rudolf Carnap, one of the Vienna Circle, a very well-known Austrian philosopher, who got to know Einstein in the late 40s and was just saying, look, Einstein was worried about this. He knew there was something missing from his account of human significance. And he said, look, the problem of now, in other words, this moment here, I am here to think about this, but I wasn't here in the past, and I won't be here in the future. So this is important to me. Worried Einstein seriously. He explained the experience of the now means something special from the man, something different from the past and future, but this important difference does not and cannot occur within physics. And it's a really important point, because it's saying, look, an objective account of science doesn't deal with something that really matters to us as human beings. And that seems to me to be something really important. Look at this final quote. Einstein thought that these scientific descriptions cannot possibly satisfy our human needs, that there is something essential about the now which is just outside the realm of science. So that seems to me is a really interesting and important point. Karl was just saying, look, Einstein was aware that as human beings, we need more than science is able to tell us. The question, therefore, is, where do we get this from? Einstein is very happy to say it's from religion. So how do we do something about this? Now, I've been talking about male figures too much. So let me introduce Mary Midgley. Mary Midgley, I was at a sort of memorial meeting for her. I knew her reasonably well. We had a great time. I think the most challenging cup of tea I ever had was with Mary Midgley. I mean, I thought it would be a nice chat about the weather up in Newcastle, but actually she was very interested in my philosophical views, which she very quickly decided were not up to standard, and so I was kind of torn to pieces, but in the nicest possible way. But anyway, she's a very able philosopher, and she is very critical of Richard Dawkins, very critical. Science cannot possibly tell us about values and meaning, and we need those. And here's what Mary Midgley says, and this I think you'll find helpful in beginning to develop the kind of conversation I'm opening up. For most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. So let me just talk about what she's saying and why it's so interesting. Look at the phrase, a number of different conceptual toolboxes, a number of different toolkits, a number of different pictures of our world. And what Mary Midgley is saying is, look, we need more than just a toolkit that can tell us how the world functions. We need a toolkit that helps us to understand what the world means, what we mean. And that's why someone who says we use science and that is it, end of discussion, is missing out on something enormously important about what it means to be human. And Mary Midgley is in effect saying that although she herself is skeptical about some aspects of Christianity, that what Christianity is saying is an integral element of this way of looking at the world, which asks two questions. How do things work? What do they mean? Or to put it even more personally, how do I work? How do you work? What do you mean? And that really is important because Midgley is really saying this needs to be done. We need multiple maps, she says, of a complex reality. What she means by that is that it's not good enough just to use one way, scientific way of thinking. You need different ways of doing this. Midgley makes the point that maps are devised to convey information. So you might think, for example, of a physical map of Europe, which will show the rivers and the mountains, but it doesn't show national frontiers. That's a political map which shows different information. And what you might say is you need to overlay these different maps to get the bigger picture. And Midgley's point is we need to overlay the maps of science and ethics and faith if we're going to get that big, fully orbed picture of what life is all about. And she makes the point that each map's designed to answer a specific set of questions. Science answers scientific questions brilliantly, but some of the questions we are asking are not really scientific. They're existential. They're moral. And that means we need other ways of approaching these. So the point I'm trying to make is that this really is important in helping us to think about science and faith. So where does this take us? So let me now begin to wrap up. What I've been doing is talking a bit about Einstein, who is really interesting. But I'm also interested in this bigger question, which is how we hold together science and faith, and how we converse about science and faith in a culture which has an almost like default position. They have to be at war with each other. So let me just use Einstein to begin to map out how we might begin to respond to questions asked about Christianity. Here are some of the points I think we can make. And again, I'm very happy to expand on these in the time of Q&A, which I know we're going to have later. Point number one, that some say science and faith are in conflict. A good historian would say, well, you know, the idea that science and religion are in permanent warfare with each other dates from about 1870 and was invented for a definite social purpose. In other words, it is not the discernment of this pattern within history. It is in fact about the creation of this pattern. If you read, for example, Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, you will find a classic example of this. Hitchens, in effect, takes individual instances and says these represent a bigger picture. For example, he makes the point that an American theologian called Timothy Dwight was skeptical about smallpox vaccination. That shows that science is opposed by these horrible religious people. A single example. But anyone, and there are people in this room tonight who know about this, anyone who knows anything about the history of smallpox vaccination, make 2 points in response. Number one, we can think of loads of Christian writers who were very supportive of smallpox vaccination, including the American theologian Jonathan Edwards, who basically, to show his students at Princeton in the 1700s that this was safe, was vaccinated himself and unfortunately died 5 days later. But the point you are making is there is a, I know, yes, you think Hitchens might mention that, but then Hitchens does not want to portray the truth. He just wants to portray what is convenient. Or we might just say, what about atheist writers who were very skeptical about smallpox vaccination, like George Bernard Shaw? He was, I'm afraid. And Shaw, basically, in the 1930s, was vigorously opposed to smallpox vaccination. And I can remember, because I go back quite a long time, watching an episode of Dr. Finley's Casebook. I think some of you may remember that with me, actually. And there was an episode about somebody having read George Bernard Shaw and not allowing their children to be vaccinated against smallpox. So here is an atheist writer who held the same objection. So you can see the pattern I'm trying to make. There is no universal pattern. And Dawkins and others who say science is always opposed to religion is simply talking historical and contemporary nonsense. Einstein helps us to do this. Secondly, we do need to know not just how this world functions, but also this deeper question of meaning. We need to emphasize that Einstein highlights the importance of this, even if he finds it difficult to answer that second question about meaning and value. He says it comes from religion, he doesn't clarify how. You and I can begin to add that element of the conversation. You might think, for example, of Jeanette Winterson's recent book, so personal memoirs. It has a title which I think is just wonderful. Why be happy when you could be normal? Isn't that wonderful? But in the book she says this, look, we need to do more than simply sleep, eat and hunt. We are meaning-seeking creatures. And until we find that meaning, we don't really live. Now, you and I can do something about that, because one of the things we can talk about very clearly is the way in which the Christian faith does engage deep questions of meaning and value. Value both in terms of what is good, but also the deeper question, do I really matter? And that seems to me to be a very important question to address as well, the importance of the individual. So let me end, if I may, with a personal story. When I was young, I was an atheist, and I used to look out of my bed when I was aged about 16 or so and look at the belt of Orion. Now, that's a group of stars that ride high in the night sky in winter. And I knew enough about them to know that they were a long way away. Light from them takes about 1,000 years to reach Earth. So in fact, when you look at them, you're actually looking at the universe as it was 1,000 years ago. But the rather melancholy thought that went through my mind was this. By the time the light from those stars that's setting out now reaches Earth, I will be dead. So it seemed to me to be a talisman, a symbol of my utter insignificance. Today, I'm a Christian, and I see things in a very different way, and I think of Psalm 8, and all of you know Psalm 8. It's about when I survey the heavens, and you look at them and think, aren't they wonderful? What is man that thou art mindful of him? And yet, of course, we matter to God. The one who named the stars knows our names as well. And so for me, as a Christian, I can rejoice at the beauty of the natural world, but also appreciate that there's something deeper and more wonderful that brings meaning to that and meaning to me. And I brought an illustration with me. It's not a very good illustration, but it's this. Here they are. Many of you are wearing these pair of spectacles. Okay, here's one point I'm going to make. Richard Dawkins has one-dimensional approach to reality. We need stereoscopic vision if you're a scientist. Well, I want to say science is good, but we need a second lens to give us that added depth. And that's why I want to say science and faith really can help us engage with and answer some of those deeper questions. And I'm very happy to follow through on that in questions after the break. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.